Welcome back. The passage of the FDI in multi-brand retail has obviously led wings in terms of expectations of what the Parliament may be able to accomplish in this session itself. And already in front of it is an important bill which the finance sector has been waiting for, the Banking Laws Amendment Bill. Actually, a bunch of bills have been sought to be amended by the Banking Companies Acquisition and Transfer Act 1970, 1980, as well as the Banking Regulation Act, which is the mother act that comprises the rules that govern all public sector and private sector banks. All the three have sought to be amended. Importantly, it gives a lot of powers to the Reserve Bank. First of all, to supervise group companies. So, to put it very bluntly, if there is a Tata Bank that is set up, Reserve Bank will have the power to call the books of, say, a Tata Steel or, a Tata Metallics, although it's not related to Tata Bank itself. The idea being that they should be able to supervise connected lending. Additionally, the Reserve Bank will also be able to supersede the entire board. At the moment, they can remove one director, two directors, even the CEO, but now they can supersede the entire board if it's passed. Ashvin Parekh of Ernst&Young is with us to tell us what this means. Well, Mr. Parekh, first up, the question which first comes to the mind is, how much time do you think, assuming this bill is passed, that you will be able to see the first license?
Let's put it this way. I mean, there are two, aspects to this. One is, as far as the preparation at the RBI is concerned, the regulators got enough time. In fact, between the government and the regulator, there has been a fair amount of time. The amendment was drafted in 2008, and then there were 3 standing committees which have gone through, the provisions of the amendment. So therefore, everybody, I mean, all the parties concerned, even the 2 discussion papers on this subject are out, particularly in the area of new banking licenses. So therefore, enough time has really been given to all the parties concerned, really to prepare for this. If the banking regulation amendment, I mean, all the 3 components were to go through the Parliament as they are, without any modification or any change, then that will be a remarkable. I mean, that would really be an important day for the history of banking, let's say, industry, to the extent that the regulator will now be able to frame the regulations very clearly.
Okay. Mr. Parekh, hi. Thanks very much for joining in. Lata actually touched upon what exactly the RBI's purview would be in the banks, for the new banks going forward post the regulation coming through. Can you, for the benefit of our viewers, list down what exactly the RBI would have more control over once the banking amendment goes through, and what would change from the current scenario that already exists?
Yeah, see, there are 3 things which become very critical in this particular regard. The first and the foremost, is the entire aspect of the amount of regulation that and the control that the regulator will be able to exercise on, the governance and the board composition. So, for instance, if the RBI believes, that, from out of the evidence, through supervision, through inspection, that the board of a certain, let's say, bank has not made prudent decisions in regards lending, or has not complied with some of the regulations or some of the requirements in spirit, not just in letter, then they can, by virtue of the new amendment, make changes in the board, and that changes can really last for a period of about 12 months. So therefore, what is becoming important is that the board and the control on the board, so that the banking proper decisions are made, is on the RBI. The second important part is, if the application person, that is the applicant, were to put out a certain business plan, and in this time around, the business plans will have to be covering a larger aspect of financial inclusion. Now, much later, if the RBI observes that the working of the bank is not in keeping with the original plan which was submitted at the time of the application, then once again the RBI can really step down and ask the management to explain, why it's doing so. That includes also, to a certain extent, the dilution of the promoter's quota. If he starts with a certain quota, whatever the new guidelines the RBI will now come out with, whether it's 40% or 30%, but in a span of about 5 years, 3 and 5 years or 2 periods, the promoters have to dilute their equity, they have to offer it to the others. So that control will also be available with the regulator.
Okay, actually that is the control which RBI has least been able to establish, isn't it, Mr. Parekh? We had the innocents of the world taking forever to bring down the promoter stake, and the Reserve Bank could only twiddle its thumbs and perhaps give newer and newer timetables. But no, I'm interested in, more importantly, what the share market is looking for. Since September, when the first whiff of this banking noise was made by the finance ministry, stocks like L&T Finance have run up, as Ekta was saying, over doubled, 140% rise. Now, what I wanted to ask you is banking such a profitable business? I mean, it may be a little more profitable than NBFCs, even that everyone is not so sure, but when the first whiff of first bunch of licenses came, the Kotaks and the Yes, and before that IndusInd, it was different. Public sector banks were not this raring to go as competitive as they are today, though you may pick a lot of faults with them. And there are already a lot of private sector banks as well. Savings rate has been deregulated. The terrain itself is now more competitive. Is a banking license going to be that lucrative?
No, well, you see, there are two aspects which will make the whole thing very lucrative, Lata. One is, if you read the Usha Thorat committee report, for instance, and it's a little negative way of looking at the value creation. I mean, it very clearly says that the room for NBFCs, I mean, in terms of their growth and dependence on public funding is going to be reduced. So there's going to be a dramatic change in regards the fate of or the future of the NBFCs. If that working group recommendation is accepted, or those recommendations are accepted, that's the negative. The positive part is how many licenses are we talking about? So, I mean, there is a certain amount of value that is ascribed to the number of licenses. I mean, it's almost like, going back to the licenses Raj or licenses situation. If 4 or 5 people, let's say, manage to get the licenses, then they clearly, distinctly, form a separate group of people, compared to, let's say, the other NBFCs who are there.
Then in that context, would takeover be a one way of growing? I don't know what the rules say at the moment or what they will say, but let us assume there is a Tata license out there, or a Reliance license, or a Birla license. I mean, Aditya Birla Money, stuff like that. You think they can buy out any of the existing banks or NBFCs more than banks? Would that be a way to, grow quickly?
No, yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, if I were to really look at the second discussion paper, and then associated with the second discussion paper, you also got to look at the RBI's paper on the foreign bank subsidiarization. Now, if you look at these two carefully, there is almost a suggestion, that if the RBI believes that certain set of particularly old sector private banks, for instance, which are still there, which are not growing in terms of their size on account of various reasons, I mean, promoter intervention being just one of them, then in that case RBI can evolve a plan under which, let's say, the new licenses can be offered. My own feel, however, is that may not really help too much. And let me articulate this point. The point is that if a person wants to, I mean, if a new applicant becomes a bank, on account of the liberal branch expansion program, he can grow into tier 2 to tier 6 as he wants. He may not necessarily want to acquire, let's say, a bank which has its own legacy issues associated with that. So all said and done, I would say it's one of the routes that's possible to the regulator, but at the same time, the new bankers, I mean, if you're looking at responsible names that you come out with, some of the very best names in the Indian corporate world today, then they would certainly want to create a bank of their own plan, and according to, I mean, the way they would like to, and then they would like to go to tier 5 and tier 6 markets to also fulfill the inclusion requirement, basically.
Mr. Parekh, we'll just leave you with one question with regards to the possibility of it even coming through, because, from a political standpoint, do you see the winter session, which has around 10 days left, for it to actually pass the banking amendments regulation bill, or do you expect it to be pushed to the budget session? Hence, the banking licenses will possibly not even surface in the next 6 to 8 months.
Very good question.
Well, let's look at it this way. I'm very optimistic about this amendment, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the standing committee recommendations, which the standing committee has made in regards various other amendments. So there is a recommendation on Insurance Act, let's say the amendment of the Insurance Acts. There are 4 of them. Likewise, if you look at the standing committee recommendations on even pension bill, the standing committee has not made any adverse observation in regards these 3 bills, that is the banking regulation and the acquisition and transfer of undertaking acts, the 70 and the 1981. So there is absolutely no adverse observation made by the standing committee in regards that. That makes me and everybody else very hopeful that it should go through in the parliament.
All right, Mr. Parekh, we'll leave it at that, but I'll tell you why people like Ekta and a lot of people outside in the world are not hopeful. It was extremely succinctly put by Chetan Bhagat. He said if Parliament decides to order a beverage, if the Congress orders tea, then the BJP will ask for coffee. The SP and the BSP will determine what they want depending on who pays the bill. And the TMC will spill it irrespective of what you order. So, it's a divided Parliament that's not looking at the content of bills. So we will have to wait and see what happens. Take a break and thank you very much, Mr. Parekh. Up next, we'll get